movement trays, shields, banners. These are the things that really finish an army off. Sometimes they may not be the most exciting things to paint, but they add a sense of accomplishment and finality to models and armies. My name is Adam, and you're watching The Lead Realm. Today's video will be taking a look at those finishing touches that I have added to my Revenge of the Doomlord army, which effectively brings this series to a close. So, if you're curious about my movement trays, or how I've made my banners, then why not stick around as we take a quick look at each of these elements. Movement trays. The movement trays that I use are MDF laser cut ones from warbases. I find that these are sturdy enough while still allowing me to customize them a little bit to my needs. They come in two parts which must be glued together. I do this with a little bit of PVA, and once that's set, I begin to taper the edges around the movement trays. I use a sharp craft knife and cut at a roughly 45-degree angle. This is just to make the edges a little bit more natural and sloped. I then paint them with PVA and dip them in sand, using the same method as I do with the rest of the army. I then trim off any excess sand with the same sharp knife so that there is a nice, clean cut to the interior edge of the movement tray. Once dry, I mix a combination of PVA glue, the same basing grey that I use on the rest of the army, and some water to thin everything out. The addition of the PVA makes the edges of these movement trays very hard wearing, so when they get pushed into other units on the tabletop, hopefully the sand doesn't chip and doesn't get pulled off. I make sure to paint this mixture around all of the sand, but also the interior and bottoms of the movement tray, again, just to give that extra barrier of safety. Once dry, the movement tray is painted in exactly the same way as the bases for the rest of the army. Movement trays are somewhat of a divisive factor in Oldhammer circles, I've found. Some love them, and the ease of which they enable you to move your units around the battlefield. Others dislike them and think they take away from the aesthetics of ranked units. For me, I see them as a bit of both. They're both a useful tool for making games easier to play, and with a little work, can still look good on the tabletop. Once the sanded part of the base is done, I go in and paint the entire inside of the movement tray black. This is just so that when models are removed, you can't see any bare wood. The final step is to add a few grass tufts here and there, again to make the movement tray feel like it's part of the same world as the bases on the models. Shields. Here is my shield worm. This is how I prepare my shields. Basically, I stick them to little toothpicks so that I can paint each one individually. I paint the shields in basically the same way that I've painted the rest of the armour throughout this army. If you're interested in this technique or this method, then please check out pretty much any of the other videos in the series, and it will show you exactly the paints and the techniques I've used. But in order to keep things consistent, I decided to paint the shields in the same ways as the rest of the armour. Once the exterior metal is done, including the patina, and the rear side of the wood painted again in the same way as the rest of the army, I decide to paint the inside of the shields purple. This is done with two thin coats of the same purple used across the rest of the army. A little bit of recessed shading with null oil, and then I decide to try and add a little bit of sort of false highlight to the flat surface, just to give a little bit of texture, which will sit underneath the transfer. I'm not sure if it was entirely necessary, but I do think that you can see on the final models where this texture has been added. The finished shields get snapped off the toothpicks and then added to the models. and it's on to transfer time. I bought these transfers off of eBay because I just wanted some simple white skulls. I won't go into a whole tutorial about using transfers as there are much more knowledgeable people on YouTube than I on this topic, but I follow the same techniques as everyone else. Softening in a little bit of water, checking that it's ready to be transferred onto the model, then painting the surface with a little bit of water to help the transfer slide on. I roughly position with a brush and then use a slightly drier brush to wick up any excess water before seating the transfer in its final position. To add a little bit of texture and weathering to the transfer, I use a piece of ripped up foam held in a small metal component holder and use this to dab on a little bit of purple and black paint over the transfer just to break up the stark white lines. Finally, I add some matte varnish over the top. Moving over to the white shields, since these models don't feature a lot of purple already, I thought I would try and bring back a bit more via the shields. I start by painting the entire shield purple, give it a quick null oil wash, and then a rough dry brush just to highlight the edges. And then I go in to pick out the details of these shields with some pure white paint. It takes a couple of coats to get this nice and opaque, but once it's done, I go back in with some thin down null oil in order to bring back a little bit of depth and definition. Once that's dry, they get highlighted back up to white, and then these are pretty much done. Here you can see a variety of different models sporting those shields. Overall, I think they help lend a bit of cohesiveness across the different units in the army, and I'm quite pleased with how they've turned out. Banners. The paper that I use for most of my banners is this heavy stock artist's paper. It's almost fabric-like in its consistency. It's extremely heavy, hard to rip, and holds its shape nicely. I find it works very well for old, tattered, and leather-style banners. I begin by ripping some very thin strips. My thought process here is these will be kind of like pennants hanging from the knight's lances. Here you can see a whole bunch that I've made. My plan is to encircle the lance so that there's a little bit of movement into the models. I went back and forth on the different colours that I might want these banners painting. My first try was to stain them with tea. Anyone growing up in the UK who watched Blue Peter will remember this trick for making old maps, but it didn't really look good. Next, I tried a variety of different contrast paints: red, purple, blue, all of the different colours that are present in the army, but again, none of them seemed to really match. In the end, I settled to go with a black, as I figure it's quite a neutral colour. It won't detract too much from the rest of the army, and it makes sense to have these dark black boding flags across an undead army to instill fear in their opponents. Once they were completely coated in the contrast black, I messily wrapped them around some old brushes so that as they dried, they would retain that spiral nature that I wanted around the lances. Once dried, I attached them to the lances by a bit of super glue on the end. Next, I turned my attention to the unit standards, beginning with the zombie standard. Unfortunately, I forgot to film the first part of this section, but I roughed out a skull shape onto the banner, as well as a few flame motifs. I then go back in with a sharp pencil to sketch on some of the details into the middle of the skull. You can see I'm not particularly good at freehanding banners, but it's something that I would like to get better at, and I figure the only way to learn to get better is to practice. So, once those free-handed details were added to the banner, I went back over the pencil lines with a little bit more black contrast and effectively tried to ink in the details. Next, it was to add a little bit more shape to the different parts of the banner. So, going back in with some very thin down brown, I started sketching in some of the different contours and shapes that I thought would exist on the skull. I then did the opposite with some highlights, adding some pure white to the raised edges, again to give that idea that there's a bit of depth here. Next was to turn my attention to the flames. Again, I wasn't really sure what I was doing, but I figured I could just test it and see what happened. I thought fading the flames out against the skull so that they sort of appeared to get hotter the further they moved away might be a good idea. While that was drying, I decided to move over to the battle standard bearer. Again, unfortunately, I neglected to record some of this, but effectively I painted one side of his banner red and the other side black, and tried to bring elements of both onto each side. So the red fades into black and the black fades into red. I thought some sort of dripping blood from a moon in the sky might invoke those kind of vampiric, undead tones that you see in a lot of the artwork. Plus, it's a nice nod to Dieter's banner that we'll see in a little bit. I highlighted the blood droplets in the same way as I would do if they were on the model. On the other side of the banner, you can see that he has a few skulls, which were sketched in and highlighted in the same way as the zombie banner. On the skeleton horseman banner, I drew a rough parchment or scroll and decided to add some text to this one. I went online and translated some text into Latin. I can't actually remember what it says now, something about "here comes death," and used a very fine highlight pen to then write this text onto the scroll. Does it look great? I'm not sure, but I think it looks okay. And again, it's all about testing. So here are those different banners, and you can see in the background we have the horsemen with their pennants. I think my favourite one is probably the zombie banner. It's not too detailed to look busy, but there's a bit of visual interest there. So I'm quite pleased with that one. Dieter's banner. The final banner that I needed to do for the army was of course Dieter's banner, and in keeping with the way that I decided to paint the model, I decided to try and replicate the banner that you can see him sporting in the Undead Army book. This involved painting the outside of the banner with the same red used on Dieter himself, and the interior in a dark navy blue. On top of this, I sketched in the main elements found in his banner, which is a moon with a red skull and then some parchment or scroll at the bottom. The moon I painted in a similar way to the one on the battle standard bearer, and the skull was again in a similar style to the one on the zombie banner, although of course this time bright red. I blocked in the main elements in solid colours and then went over the top using thin brush strokes with black contrast, again trying to sketch in the details and filling them in as I went. I quite like his goofy smile here, but it is reasonably accurate to the original model. Once the skull was painted with the details, I went in over the top and added the spark, or I think glowing eye effect found in the original banner. It was quite scary painting over all of my hard work, but in the end I think it turned out okay. Once all of the main elements were in, it was time to go back and start highlighting. Again, trying to follow the existing artwork, I tried to place my highlights in the same places that they could be found on the artwork of the original model. Next, I went around and added a black outline to the various elements. I needed to add the bats and the clouds that you could find in the backgrounds. The bats were fairly simple and were solid black. The clouds, I started with a grey and then added some highlights at the top in a lighter white and some shadows at the bottom in a grey. Not pictured here, I also went in and used the same fine line pen to add the text found on the original model. The final step was to add a black outline to the centre artwork of the banner. A couple more highlights right at the back on the blue, and I think we're done. I trimmed up the edges of the banner and wrapped it around the model. A couple of dots of super glue on the back, and squeezing the parts of the banner together, and he's done. So, with these elements completed, this effectively marks the end of this project. All of the units found in the Revenge of the Doomlord army list have been completed, and all of the little extras have also been finished. However, I think before I start my next project, I want to add a couple more units to this army just to give myself a little bit of variety and enable me to play it as a regular undead list, not featuring Dita. So, my next video, I'll be adding a couple more bits and pieces to the army before we get stuck in with the next project. For today, however, I just want to say, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Do you do these elements of your armies all together at the end of the project? Or do you complete them as you complete each unit? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. But, as always, thanks for joining me, stay old school, and long live the lead.